Reaction to Niall Ferguson's conversation with Sean Carroll. The main idea I got from this conversation is that everybody's paranoid about something. We in the West, particularly in the United States, we're paranoid about our freedom, and therefore that's the thing we're fighting for. Other countries are paranoid about other things. Niall Ferguson makes arguments which are interesting, in my view, wrong. I must say my tolerance for British scholars with interesting accents, signaling some sort of intellectual superiority is pretty limited. But I nevertheless, I think that Niall Ferguson is like Nassim Taleb and these types of people. They're kind of on the brink of snake oil and intellectual creativity. I think that's where they stand, and therefore they're worth reading and listening to. But you also can't take them too seriously. This is the Not Even Wrong podcast. It's May 9th, 2021. This is Crim Delcode. It's a Sunday, no updates. We're still down 8.2% for the year. The market's up 11.2%. We're underperforming by 19%. So now Ferguson talks to Sean Carroll, and it's an interesting talk. It's in particular about his book Doom. And there's a couple of arguments he makes I would like to discuss here because they do apply to a general experience, but most importantly also to the experience of the hedge fund world. So now talks about the importance of networks when it comes to history. What he's trying to say is that in sort of traditional history research, we tend to read archives of governments, of central governments, and we underestimate the power of networks. I think this is more important than ever today with the ascent of decentralized networks, of decentralized currencies. So he makes a very interesting argument, which is, well, those types of decentralized networks, and what he talks about is more things like the Freemasons, the Rothschild family, and those types of networks that have been operating under the radar of history. And he's written books, and he talks about this at length in this conversation. So I think that's an interesting tidbit, and I don't want to go much deeper in that here because my other argument, the most important argument, is the following. So Niall says that we should learn from Taiwan and Korea when it comes to COVID-19 pandemic because they are always paranoid and they responded very fast by doing things like contact tracing, and everybody was wearing masks and all that stuff. And I absolutely vehemently disagree with that. First and foremost, I think, well, okay, here's the thing. I do agree that pretty much everybody, every country, every person, every society is paranoid about something. And while the Taiwanese are paranoid about losing their independence to China, and the Koreans are probably paranoid about pretty much anything that could go wrong in Asia, we in the West, particularly in the United States, we're paranoid about losing our freedom. Our freedom is the one thing we care about the most. That's why we're paranoid. And this is exactly what happened during COVID-19. The big conversation here wasn't even how can we prevent it, how can we make sure it doesn't happen. The first and most important conversation has always been, okay, how can we do this by preserving our freedom? Some people are spitting at that, and there's a lot of political movement, and we can blame it on Donald Trump, or we can praise the Democrats for saving us. I don't care. But deep in the bones of every American, in particular the West, where I live, in California and Texas and all these places, freedom has been the most important thing. This is what we're most paranoid about. And I think I speak for a lot of people when we say that if we don't protect our freedom, protecting everything else is almost futile, even our lives. What's the point of living in a totalitarian regime? What's the point of living in a state where Janet Yellen prints money and takes money away from us through taxes? What's the point of making money and not being free to spend it? What's the point of making money and not being free to live the way we want to live? Those are fundamental beliefs that we have here in the West. I think they are ingrained, and they started with the Enlightenment, and now they're ingrained in us throughout the 250 years that we had this country, and in general Western democracies. You can argue this is a bad thing, a good thing. This podcast, particular episode, is not meant to do that. My personal stance is yes, it's the right thing to fight for freedom. I just want to point this out, and I want to. This is a reaction to this conversation Niall Ferguson had with Sean Carroll. So while he's saying we in the West we're kind of sclerotic, we have this bureaucracy, our health system doesn't work because we're complacent, and we're not paranoid about, let's say, a war with China or a cyber war with Russia. I would say, look, we are probably paying attention to these things, but what we're really paranoid about is our freedom. Our freedom is the most important thing for us, and that does not apply to other people. Not everybody is obsessed with freedom. I think, let's say Taiwan, they are obsessed with maybe independence of China or something, or keeping their wealth away from the Chinese taxman or something like that. I don't know. I'm not familiar with those circumstances. I know in Europe, freedom is not the most important thing. I grew up in Europe. Europe is mostly concerned about not repeating World War II. I think we're still in those. Maybe now this generation of leaders, or the next generation, the old generation of leaders, Angela Merkel and people like that, they still are very, very deeply rooted in World War II and the follow-up on that, the East Germany and the communism and the Cold War. This is, I think that's what Europe is paranoid about. So they're willing to give up their freedoms. The EU is, in a nutshell, an attempt to prevent World War II again by combining everybody in Europe and therefore not allowing anybody to become extraordinarily powerful or having funny ideas like Nazi Germany, excuse me, had in the 30s. So that's what Europe's paranoid about. The Arab world's paranoid about other things. I can't, maybe paranoid about Israel or something. I don't know the details there, but my point here is that we're all paranoid about something. And my answer to Niall is yes, we're at least in the US, we're absolutely paranoid about freedom. Now, this leads me to the conversation. I also to the next point in this conversation, which is interesting, and that's why I said in the beginning, my tolerance for people like Niall Ferguson is limited, but he is interesting because he talks about the necessity to have a more organic response to nature, or building societies that are more adaptive and organic. And what he means with that is that if we have, let's say, a central authority like the CDC, or I think that's the health or Center for Pandemic, I'm not sure. Well, anyway, our health organizations here in the United States, they're very central, very bureaucratic, and their main incentive is to preserve themselves like any other bureaucratic institution, and that's not good for us. We need to have more adaptive, more flexible systems in terms of government, and I think it also applies to companies. And I think this is, we've spoken about this in the past. We've asked that question many times. How should we organize a company to generate wealth? Because this is part of our business as hedge fund managers or Orange Capital Partners, is to not just understand business dynamics and maybe make predictions about the future in terms of, okay, which technology will win or things like that. We also have to understand, okay, how is a certain company organized? For example, Tesla. Is Tesla organized in a way that they can grow flexibly into a large company? And there's two questions here. One is, how can they adapt to threats from the outside? And second, how can they grow and deal with their own size? And I think the answer here is pretty open. I don't have this is not a closed-end formula by no means. This is an open conversation, open research. As far as we're concerned, I think academia is also not much further. But there's a couple of points I want to make here. Number one, Tesla is by far the most flexible company we know, because they're constantly generating new knowledge, and the knowledge that compounds on top of that knowledge, by definition, is new knowledge again, and the company has a way to incorporate that knowledge and make it useful. So, for example, they started with AI even later than Waymo, but then they overtook them in terms of certain applications. They were certainly not the first battery company in the world, but they overtook all the battery companies, and now they are all catching up. They are definitely not the first solar company. Now with the rooftop solar business, they're going to overtake everybody else. They have invented the storage business, utility scale, but even there were other companies before. So they've shown in multiple times that they're able to overtake competitors. To me, that's proof enough that Tesla is a very flexible, adaptive company, and therefore very comfortable with that investment from that perspective. I think it's worth looking at these things also when we invest in other companies, and I've spoken about this also in the past. Let's say our CRISPR index stocks are a bit less, let's say, adaptive in that sense, and maybe more hierarchical and more, they're more at risk of being sclerotic because they are still embedded in the healthcare system. Not all of them. Twist Bioscience is a very, very adaptive, flexible company. Pacific Bioscience is very flexible and adaptive, but in particular our CRISPR stocks, which are still embedded in the pharmaceutical supply chain and therefore, FDA approvals and all that stuff, they have to deal with certain things that I think central bureaucracies just are not avoidable. So it's not always perfect. I think also other companies that are out there, the Spotifys and the Shopify's and all these Nvidias and all these fancy stocks that have done well in the last couple of years. I think for people that are invested in those stocks, it's worth thinking about how flexible are they, how adaptive are they, how can they respond to threats from the outside, and those sort of things. I think those are worthwhile thoughts for us at Orange Capital Partners. Again, we're very happy with Tesla. We're happy with some of our biotech stocks. Others, we must admit that maybe flexibility and adaptiveness a la Tesla is almost impossible because of the nature of the business. But to get back to the beginning of this podcast, which is a reaction to Niall Ferguson's conversation with Sean Carroll, I think the summary here is that I think Niall is a very interesting historian because he looks at things from a different perspective, and that by itself is very, very useful. But as a historian, he's still, by definition, stuck in the past. He tries to extrapolate to the future, and I think that's just not a good idea. But what's the value of history? What's the value of reading or talking to a person like Niall Ferguson? I think it's the value of talking to Niall Ferguson. What's the value of this? Well, I think we have this tendency to try to predict the future, and that's wrong. I don't think that's what we should be doing. I think what we should be doing when we have a conversation with Niall Ferguson is simply listen and try to understand what he's saying, and then just try to adapt to today's world, to your problems, and see, okay, can I learn from this today? So, for example, he says, well, we're not paranoid enough. Our response to COVID-19 has been not paranoid. But what does that really mean? Well, my answer is we are actually, it made me think. It made me think about this, and my conclusion is we were paranoid. And this is actually the answer for a lot of the political uproar that all this COVID has caused with the masks and the vaccines now. It is about our freedom. Don't tell me what to do. Don't impose rules on me. I don't care what the purpose is. We have this paranoia, again, in the US, particularly on the west side of the US, that we don't want to be imposed onto our lifestyles. So that's number one. Number two, what I took from this conversation is that it's worth looking at networks when we look at history, and in particular because networks don't have archives. So when we talk, let's say in the future, about cryptocurrency and decentralized networks and smart contracts and those sort of things, it's going to be more difficult to analyze these things because there's no archives, there's no 10Ks, there's no Fed, there's no minutes of the Fed, none of that stuff. Ethereum does not have minutes. Yes, we crave for leaders for exactly that reason, because we want to listen what they say so we can quote them. But I think that's dangerous, and we have to find new ways to analyze this new decentralized world. This is literally a challenge for not just for historians, but particularly for analysts, for investors who are dealing with real time, with the contemporary pros and cons of for example, a decentralized network like Ethereum. So this is, we don't have, like, let's say investors, when I grew up on Wall Street, I was used to reading transcripts of earnings calls and the minutes of the Fed and those sort of things. That type of research, not just that it's obsolete, it's not even available. So we have to find new ways of doing research. For example, what I'm doing is I'm looking at what academics are doing and trying to extrapolate from their problem-solving attempts what is actually going on right now. Let's say, what's the Ethereum community on the academic side doing? What are they spending their time on? Maybe I can learn those are the problems, and then therefore I can learn, okay, this is what I can expect from, let's say, Ethereum going forward. So those are, it's a very different way of analyzing situations. And the third thing I took from Niall Ferguson, Sean Carroll, is that you want to have adaptive institutions. No matter if it's government, companies, even your personal life, you need to be adaptive. Look at our body. We get injured, we heal. We don't, hopefully we don't have to intervene. Sometimes we have to intervene, but most of the time, our body heals by itself. Nature heals on its own. Nature finds ways to solve problems. The genetic intelligence that we have in nature through natural evolution is a lot more adaptive, a lot more sturdy than this sclerotic top-down organizations that we're used to. It also reminds me of David Eagleman's book, Lifewired, where he talks about the adaptability of our brain and the possibility of our brain, of our neurons, to repurpose themselves according to need. For example, if we get brain injury, our brain actually readapts and can develop new functionality in areas where maybe functionality was different. So this is a very similar argument that Niall Ferguson makes, which is when we design things, we should think more like that. And that's exactly what David says in his book. Lastly, I just want to add one more thing, which Niall said, and this also underlines the importance of talking to people like that. He says that lots of historians, they try to reason by analogy, and they go back and they say, oh, this is the 30s again, and this is, Nazis and inflation and all that. And he says it's actually wrong. I think we should look at the world, if we even look at history and try to extrapolate, we should not look at actual events such as, let's say, inflation or something. We should look a lot more at the networks and the power structures that are typically in networks. And then he compares today's world more with the sort of Renaissance, post-Renaissance world, when networks such as the Medici networks and later on the Rothschild networks, these kinds of networks started growing in the Freemasons, and then the US Revolution, which was enabled by networks which were much more intrusive and much more important than we think. And I think I've made that argument before. This time today reminds me of the Renaissance in a sense that we have a new territory exploring, which is decentralized networks such as Ethereum, Bitcoin, and that is a new territory and new types of governance and new types of law and new types of contracts, smart contracts. We spoke about this before. That I completely agree with Niall Ferguson that we are much more similar to those times than maybe to the 1930s. And I think that's an interesting tidbit again that I took from this conversation. Thank you.